Imagine waking up tomorrow morning, grabbing your phone right off the nightstand, and seeing a text message.
Okay.
But it's not just any message, right? It looks entirely official. It seems to come from like your most trusted mentor.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the person who has guided your entire worldview, maybe someone you even consider to be a spiritual authority.
Oh,
And the message essentially says, the single most important event in human history just happened, and you missed it. You were left behind.
man, just hearing that scenario, you can almost feel your stomach drop.
Ike.
Yeah, that sudden icy rush of absolute panic. It's that sinking realization that everything you thought you were a part of has just, well, it's moved on without you.
Total freefall. I mean, just complete panic. And that feeling of being entirely left behind by God is exactly where we're starting today.
It's a heady place to start.
It really is. So our mission for this deep dive is to look at a really fascinating ancient moment of mass panic. We've got a study document today titled 02-Have We Missed the Gathering? And it focuses squarely on a very specific biblical text.
2 Thessalonians, right?
Exactly. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. And we are going to be acting as detectives today.
I like that.
Yeah, we're tracking the logical flow of the Apostle Paul's argument as he essentially tries to talk this terrified community off the ledge. I mean, he is trying to answer their burning, desperate question, have we missed the gathering?
It's a brilliant piece of crisis management, honestly. We're watching someone try to counter profound, emotionally devastating misinformation, like in real time.
Exactly. So for you listening, we're going to read some key verses directly from the text with their references to see exactly how this unfolds. Let's step out of that, hypothetical smartphone scenario and into the actual historical reality of these Thessalonian believers.
Because to really grasp the weight of the text, we have to first understand the problem they were facing.
Right, and why it was so utterly terrifying for them. So let's look at 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Paul introduces the core issue right out of the gate.
What does he say?
He writes, "Now we request you, brethren, with regard to the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him, that you not be quickly shaken from your composure, or be disturbed either by a spirit or a message or a letter, as if from us, to the effect that the day of the Lord has come."
There's so much to unpack there, but the emotional state of this community is front and center.
Yeah, shaken is a pretty visceral word.
It really is. Their whole foundation was rocking. They genuinely believed that the day of the Lord, this ultimate foundational event they had built their entire lives around, they thought it had already happened.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if we just hear the phrase day of the Lord, it might just sound like, I don't know, a deed on a calendar to us today. But for these first century believers, what did that term actually represent? Why would missing it cause such existential dread?
Well, that's the crucial context, right? The Thessalonian church was a young community, and they were facing intense daily persecution.
Mm-hmm.
So for them, the day of the Lord and, our gathering together to him, it wasn't just some abstract theology. It was their singular hope of rescue.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, it represented the exact moment when divine justice would finally be served, when their suffering would be vindicated, and when they would be united with Christ.
So if they thought it already happened.
Exactly. If that day had already come and gone and they were still just sitting there being persecuted, the implication is horrifying.
Yeah.
It meant their suffering was meaningless. It meant they had been abandoned.
Man, it's like showing up to the airport for the trip of a lifetime. The trip you've been banking absolutely everything on to escape a terrible situation.
Yeah.
Only to get to the desk and be told, the plane left yesterday without you.
That's exactly the feeling.
And to make matters worse, they even show you a counterfeit ticket with your name crossed out. Because the text specifically points out how this fake news reached them, right? It mentions a spirit, a message, or a letter as if from Paul.
Right.
How did this kind of misinformation actually work back then? Because it wasn't just a random rumor.
No, it's fascinating to look at the mechanics of first century misinformation. So a spirit in this context refers to someone in their gathering actually standing up and claiming a prophetic utterance.
Like they're speaking for God.
Precisely. Supposedly speaking right on behalf of God. And a message would be the spoken word, a rumor circulating with real authority. But the most insidious mechanism mentioned here is that forged letter.
A fake letter from Paul.
Yeah. In a culture without mass communication, letters from apostolic founders like Paul were the ultimate authority. Someone had essentially fabricated a document mimicking Paul's exact style and authority, just to legitimize this terrifying claim.
But wait, I have to push back a little here.
Sure, go ahead.
If you receive a letter that says the end of the world has already happened, wouldn't you just like look out the window and say, no, it hasn't?
You would think so.
Right. Why were the Thessalonians so easily shaken by this claim just because it had a veneer of authority?
Because human beings are incredibly vulnerable to authoritative claims, especially when we're already under stress. When a claim comes from a source we are conditioned to trust, whether that's a supposed prophetic spirit, a confident speaker, or a forged document, our critical thinking often just short circuits.
That makes a lot of sense. The panic just kind of takes over.
Exactly. The panic sets in the very moment the new, terrifying information overwhelms your prior knowledge. They didn't just have a momentary doubt. They were fundamentally destabilized because this fake news hijacked their trust in apostolic authority.
Wow. Okay, so
Uh-huh.
when people in that state of existential dread, you can't just, pat them on the back and say, there, don't worry about it.
No, that never works.
You have to give them something solid to stand on. But if they're panicking about missing the event, how does Paul actually calm them down here?
Well, he doesn't offer platitudes. He provides a chronological checklist.
Let's look at his immediate answer in verse 3. Paul gives a definitive, totally clear negative answer. He writes, "Let no one in any way deceive you, for it will not come unless the apostasy comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction."
See, he introduces two absolute prerequisites there.
Right, two massive, unavoidable events that must happen first.
It's a masterful pivot by Paul. He shifts their focus entirely away from their internal subjective panic, and he points them toward external observable markers.
But does that actually work in practice? I mean, if you're terrified that a cake is burning in the oven and you're running around the kitchen panicking,
Right.
and I just calmly point to the counter and say, look, we haven't even mixed the batter yet. The eggs are still right there in the carton. The panic stops. Is that essentially what Paul is doing here by bringing up these prerequisites?
That is exactly what he's doing. He is grounding their theology in observable reality. And to answer your question about whether logic works during a panic attack,
Yeah.
it does when the logic proves the source of the panic is a physical impossibility.
Oh, that's good.
When you're caught in a spiral of spiritual or emotional anxiety, your brain just spins out of control. By pointing to concrete, massive events that have demonstrably not occurred, Paul immediately disarms the deception.
So he's saying, look at the counter.
Yes, look at the counter. The apostasy hasn't happened. The man of lawlessness hasn't been revealed. The batter isn't mixed, so the oven isn't even on. It requires them to use their eyes and their logic, which breaks the spell of the panic.
It's so practical. But we should probably define what he means by the apostasy, because that's one of those heavy theological words that gets thrown around.
It is.
He's just talking about, a few people deciding to sleep in on a Sunday. Right?
Yeah,
Right.
not at all. In this specific context, the apostasy refers to a definitive mass rebellion, like a visible, global falling away from the truth.
A major event.
A seismic spiritual event. Paul's point is that this isn't something that would happen quietly in a corner while they weren't looking. If the day of the Lord had actually arrived, this massive rebellion would have already been obvious to absolutely everyone.
Okay, so Paul proves the oven isn't even on. But that leaves a hanging thread for these believers. What are these unmixed batter elements? What exactly are these markers on the timeline?
Well, Paul briefly reminds them of what he had already taught them in person.
Yeah, in verses 4 and 5, he mentions this figure, the man of lawlessness, and lists some very specific characteristics. He says this figure opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God.
Right. And then, in verses 6 and 7, Paul introduces another crucial element to this timeline, the present restraint.
Let me read that. He writes, "And you know what restrains him now, so that in his time he will be revealed. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains will do so until he is taken out of the way." Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Because, as anyone who studies this text knows, the moment you mention the man of lawlessness sitting in the temple, or this mysterious restrainer holding back the forces of evil,
Oh, people love to speculate.
it is incredibly tempting to jump right down a massive rabbit hole. Like, who exactly is this lawless figure? Is it a historical emperor, a future dictator? And what or who is the restrainer? Is it the Holy Spirit? Human government?
People have debated this for literal centuries.
Right. But I want to actively push back on that urge for us today.
Huh.
As fascinating as those identities are, for the purpose of Paul's letter right here, in this exact moment of crisis, the identities aren't actually the main point, are they?
I completely agree, and it's a vital distinction to make.
Yeah.
If we get bogged down in trying to identify the restrainer right now, we actually lose the thread of Paul's pastoral argument. The mere fact that these things are currently restrained, that this lawless one has not yet taken his seat in the temple and displayed himself as God, that alone proves that the day of the Lord hasn't begun.
So they're just placeholders for the timeline.
Exactly. Paul is using these figures entirely as chronological anchors to stabilize a rocking ship.
And just as a quick note to you listening,
Yeah.
we are absolutely going to dedicate separate future deep dives entirely to exploring the identities of the lawless one and the restrainer.
Oh, for sure.
Our sources make it clear those are incredibly rich topics that deserve their own full sessions. But today, we're keeping our eyes on the timeline. We're answering the Thessalonians' main question. Have we missed it?
Right. And since the restrainer is currently holding things back, preventing this ultimate climax of evil, the logical next question for the Thessalonians would be, what happens when the dam finally breaks?
Mhm.
If we are waiting for this terrifying figure to be revealed, how does that story actually end?
Which takes us right to verses 8 through 12, and this is the climax of the passage, featuring what I think is just a brilliant anatomy of deception.
It really is.
Paul tells them the future sequence. And he isn't doing this to scare them all over again, but to show them exactly how the story ends so they aren't left in suspense. He says in verses 8 and 9 that the lawless one will be revealed, and that his coming will be according to the working of Satan, with all power and signs and false wonders.
But notice how quickly Paul resolves the tension there. He doesn't linger on the power of the lawless one.
No, he doesn't.
In verse 8, he states the ultimate victory, whom the Lord will slay with the breath of his mouth and bring to an end by the appearance of his coming.
With the breath of his mouth. It's not even a prolonged battle. It's definitive. It's effortless.
Completely effortless.
But then, Paul shifts gears in a major way. Having established the timeline and the ultimate victory, he pauses to explain the actual mechanics of how this future deception works. Let's look closely at verses 10 through 12.
Go ahead.
Paul writes that this deception comes with all the deception of wickedness for those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth so as to be saved. For this reason, God will send upon them a deluding influence so that they will believe what is false, in order that they all may be judged who did not believe the truth but took pleasure in wickedness.
This is perhaps the most profound psychological and spiritual insight in the entire passage.
It's intense.
It is. Paul is addressing a fundamental question here. Why do people fall for lies? Deception, according to Paul here, does not happen randomly.
It's not just bad luck.
Why? It isn't just that people were in the wrong place at the wrong time or that they weren't smart enough to figure out the puzzle.
Yeah. And looking closely at the text, there's a striking phrase. It says they did not receive the love of the truth.
That's the key.
It doesn't say they didn't know the truth or that they didn't have access to the facts. It says they didn't love it. How does what we love affect our susceptibility to being conned?
Well, it changes everything. If we connect this to the broader understanding of human psychology, we almost always believe what we want to believe.
Oh, for sure.
Deception finds fertile ground in people who, as the text says in verse 12, took pleasure in wickedness rather than truth. When your heart prefers something other than the truth, whether that's power or comfort or a narrative that lets you be the center of the universe without accountability,
Yeah.
you are actively laying out a welcome mat for deception.
Man, it makes me think of how modern social media algorithms work.
Oh, that's a great connection.
Right. An algorithm doesn't really care about what is objectively true. It cares about what you engage with. It feeds you what you already want to see, what already validates your internal biases and your desires. Is Paul essentially saying that the human heart has an algorithm, and if that algorithm prefers wickedness, it will inevitably feed on deception?
That is a perfect analogy, yes. You can have all the right data right in front of you, but if you don't love the truth, your internal algorithm will find a way to twist the data to fit what you actually delight in.
Wow.
Paul is showing that spiritual deception is fundamentally a moral issue. It's an issue of the affections, long before it's a cognitive one. Because they refused to love the truth, they became entirely susceptible to the lie.
So it's not an intellectual failure, it's an affection failure.
Exactly. And the text takes it a step further, stating that God will send upon them a deluding influence.
Which sounds harsh.
It does, but it's as if the natural divine consequence of actively rejecting and hating the truth is that you get handed over to the deception you preferred anyway.
Yeah.
You want a reality where you are God. Fine, you will be given over to the delusion that the lawless one is God.
That is heavy. But it also circles back to why the Thessalonians, who presumably did love the truth, were so eager for Paul's clarification.
Right.
They wanted the truth, even if it meant realizing they still had to endure persecution and wait longer for the gathering. They just needed the timeline straightened out because their hearts were actually in the right place.
That is exactly the pastoral comfort here. They were momentarily confused by a very sophisticated piece of misinformation, a forged letter, or a false prophecy, but they weren't the targets of this ultimate blinding deception.
Because they loved the truth.
Because their fundamental affections were rooted in Christ. They just needed the facts laid out in chronological order to clear the fog.
So let's step back from the intense imagery of the lawless one, the working of Satan, and that ultimate destruction. Let's return to the core pastoral purpose of this entire text.
Let's do it.
We set out to act as detectives, tracing Paul's logic to answer the Thessalonians' desperate question. And the key conclusion from our sources is incredibly clear.
The Thessalonians have absolutely not missed the gathering.
Period.
Yeah.
The apostasy has not yet occurred. The man of lawlessness has not yet been revealed. The restrainer is still active, holding back that final tide of evil. Therefore, the day of the Lord has not begun.
It is a beautifully constructed argument. It takes a community terrified of having been left behind, completely untethers them from the fake news they consumed, and anchors them firmly back in reality using a definitive, checkable timeline.
Which brings us to the real application here, and I want to address this directly to you, the listener. So what does this all mean for you?
That's the big question.
How does this ancient passage comfort believers today who fear they might have missed God's plan? Think about that spiritual FOMO, the fear of missing out on what God is doing, or the panic that you've somehow taken a wrong turn, missed a sign, and ruined the timeline of your own life.
What's fascinating here is that the antidote to that kind of panic hasn't changed in 2,000 years.
Really?
Yeah. The comfort comes from recognizing that God's plans aren't chaotic, secret events that slip by unnoticed in the middle of the night while you aren't looking. There is a sequence, there is a structure.
Paul's logical timeline is the ultimate antidote to spiritual panic. It tells you to stop looking at the forged letters of your own anxieties. Stop listening to the alarming rumors of the culture around you and look at the actual markers God has laid out.
Look at the counter.
Exactly. The cake batter isn't mixed. You haven't missed it. You are exactly where you were supposed to be on the timeline.
And that brings an immense sense of peace. You don't have to live on edge, wondering if you slept through the alarm clock of history.
The alarm clock of history.
Yeah.
I love that. That brings us right back to where we started today. Remember that text message we imagined at the beginning?
Oh yeah, the terrifying one.
The one that sends you into a total freefall, claiming you missed the most important event ever. What Paul is saying in 2 Thessalonians is, delete the text. Consider the source. Check the actual timeline. You haven't missed a thing.
Such a powerful takeaway.
But while the timeline provides incredible peace, the mechanics of how people are deceived should keep us incredibly vigilant. And on that note, we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on verses 10 through 12. We talked about how deception takes root because someone delights in wickedness rather than loving the truth.
And this is the question for you to explore on your own. If our ultimate susceptibility to being deceived is truly rooted in what we love, how much of our ability to see reality clearly in our everyday lives is tied not to our intelligence or the sheer volume of news we consume, but to the deep, hidden affections of our own hearts?
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.